Greetings everyone once more, and this is the fourth workshop of the free Java Bootcamp. So today we are talking about functions and methods in Java. This is a very fundamental concept to programming in general, so much so that there's a whole style of programming called functional programming, because functions are like the most important thing in software development. So I put this image right in front of you right now. I hope you all recognize what that is. So that's a grinding mill. It is a very good analogy for a function. So if you look at the grinding mill, you're going to notice that it has some form of input. You put something you want to grind, and some form of processing, the way what it does to the thing that you put inside, and it gives you some form of output. So functions or methods are somehow very similar to this grinding mill. I like to think about this grinding mill when I'm trying to explain functions, because when you're writing a function, you're trying to write a machine that takes some form of input, does some processing to it, and produces some form of output. So this is an example of a function in Java. We're going to write this manually in a second. So if you look at our grinding mill analogy, you can see where the input, the processing, and the output are. From our last session, you can already recognize that here A and B are variables of type integer, and this line just says add the value of A and B. So this is a function that adds two numbers. This function returns the sum of two numbers. It takes a number, an integer A, it takes another one, an integer B. It does some processing to it. The processing it does is that it adds them together, and then the output is that it returns the sum, which is C in this case. In Java, when defining a function, you must specify at the start what type the function is going to return. So the way I read this is that this is a function called add that takes two numbers of type integers and returns an integer. This is a function called add that takes two numbers of type integer, A and B, and returns an integer. And then we're going to see this a bit more practically. Let's look at it again from the point of view of the machine. So this is like the function called add. It takes the input, does some processing to it, and returns an output. As a software developer, you'll be writing functions almost every day. And every time that you have some logic to implement, let's say, let me give a clear example. A user is trying to log into your website, they put in their email. You can write a function that takes that email address, like here, and validates that the email has the right parts, or validate that the email is correct, and return maybe true or false, depending whether the email is correct or not. That's an example of a function. So as a developer, you write functions every day, everywhere. And as you go further, you actually realize that there are programming models where everything you write are basically just functions. Before we go further, I think I forgot to highlight something very important, which is that the term, you see the topic is functions and methods. The term functions and methods here are used interchangeably. In Java, it is mostly called methods. In some programming languages, you can call them functions. In some other programming languages, you can call them procedures even. They call them procedures, functions, methods. They're generally referring to the same thing for our purposes and context. Later on, maybe much later, we're going to distinguish between pure functions and methods. So there are some mathematical differences in how that is. For example, what we have on the screen here is what you might call a pure function. But in Java, you generally hear the term method. If you pick a Java textbook, you hear people refer to this as a method. So the add method adds two integers. So if you hear function, method, procedures, you can think of them as the same thing. They're actually the same thing. Now, let's look a little bit about the jargon. Please remember, like what I shared earlier, never be afraid by jargon, right? Never be afraid of jargon. Remember never to be afraid of jargon. There's a lot of terms in this programming field, but they are basically representing simple things. What goes inside these brackets, like this A and B, the inputs, you see here is the inputs. What goes inside these brackets are called, in programming terms, the parameter list. These are the parameters of the function. So when you hear somebody say the parameters of the function, they simply mean what goes as input to that function here. And this thing written here, this int before the name of the function in Java, is called a return type. So we're saying add takes two parameters and has a return type of int. Everything from this squiggly bracket, from this curly brace to this other curly brace here, comprise what they call the function body. It's the body of the function. That's where you define what the function actually does. It's in this place that you define what the function actually does. And then finally, if your function has some return type, because it's possible to have a function that has no return type, but if your function has a return type, then you have a return statement. So the new keyword we're learning today in all of this is this return. Return tells the compiler to output something after this function is called. So here we're telling return C, and C here is simply A plus B, right? So C is the result of A plus B, and we return it. I don't know if there are any questions to this up to here. I'm just trying to show you again here what we're talking about. If this was in programming jargon, we'll call this the parameter list. We'll call this the function body. We'll call this the return type, and the return statements, whatever is returned from the function. Here we have our simple Java program that we already know about, the hello world. And if you look keenly, you'll realize that this main is actually a function. It respects what we just said. If you ignore these first two statements, which we have not yet discussed, you see that main is a function, the return type is void, and the parameter list is this thing, string of args. And this is a function body. Because the return type is void, it means I don't need that return statement, right? I don't need to say return void, something like that. This is implied because we're trying to say main returns nothing. But the return type here is void. If you look well, this is actually a function. Let's write our own function, the function we just saw some minutes ago, right? So let's say int add, like we said, takes two parameters, an int a and an int b, and what int add does is that it adds both of them inside a variable c, and it returns the value of c. So this is our example that we just had some minutes ago. We can test it by calling it in here, since this is where everything gets executed. So 34 here is A, and 2 here is B. Let's make it a bit more clearer so that everyone can see. So what's happening here is we're saying add 34 and 2. Let's actually run it. You will see the output of that. So we have here in our output, A is 34, B is 2, the result is 36. So we have a function called add that adds two numbers. This is how it does it. It doesn't know, it's not because it is called add. You could have called it anything, right? Let's call it tomatoes. You could have called it anything. The add is not where the meaning is. The meaning is in what you write inside the function body, right? The result is the same, even though we're calling our function now tomatoes. It's just a function. The name, you choose the name following basic Java rules. I don't know if there are any questions about this. Yeah, go on.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
I have a question concerning the positive that is in front of the A and the positive sign that's in front of the B. Is it necessary to really put those signs?
Yes. In one of our next lessons, we're going to talk about operators. This plus is called an operator in this case. And it's a positive sign, like you said, yes, but in this case, it is not adding. It is doing what we call concatenation. It is appending A to this string. We're saying that A is this value. A is 34, as you see here, for example. A is just join the value of A after this text, because you cannot add a number and a text actually. So this A now is actually a text. We're just joining the text 34 behind this text here. So you see, even this space I've put here is being respected, right? That's why there's space before the 34. So A is 34. You can try it along. This is not addition, this is concatenation. Here, this is addition. We're adding A plus B. This is two numbers. Here, we're joining two strings. So we have a workshop session on operators. We're going to talk about plus, minus, and so on. It's going to make a lot more sense. I'm just using plus because it's a very simple one, even though we have not yet discussed that more. But we have a workshop on that. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, so thank you. That's answered my question. Then, sir, I also have one question concerning that the tomatoes and the art is the same. Does it mean that the art and the tomatoes are just like employing the value?
What is happening with the tomatoes, the art, like what you're asking about, is just a name that I can remember. If you go inside the JVM, inside the compiler, it's not going to be called tomatoes. It's going to have some coded name after it gets compiled or whatever, but it's just a name that I, the developer, can remember. So I'm calling my function add because it has meaning. It's good to give meaningful names to your function so that when I look at the function, I can know what it does. I could have even called it add two numbers. It's even more meaningful, right? So this is a function that adds two numbers. I was giving it tomato just to show you that no matter the name, it will work, but still, please try to give meaningful names to your functions, right? Try to give meaningful names to your functions.
Okay, sir, thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. So this function just does this one thing. It returns nothing, that's why you have void. And it just does this one thing, which is it prints hello and the name that you passed. So name is of type string, it's a reference type string, and it prints hello and the name that you passed. The code says there's a main function, that's the first place that gets executed, and the main function simply has a call to this function called greet. Greet takes a string, one variable, one parameter of type string, and returns nothing. But in his body, he does this operation, which is he prints this text to the command line, to the console. Let's run it and see what that looks like. So you see here the output is hello Java, right? You see it. So this is our code. If you have any questions again, you can ask. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining. This was a shorter one, but a very, very important one. I'm going to try to share some links and resources to help you practice. Please try writing functions. You are going to need it all through your career every single day. So thanks again for being there, and see you on Wednesday.